Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering your company can no longer pay overseas suppliers. Not because your bank failed, not because the internet went down, not because hackers attacked, but because another country quietly decided to stop recognizing your access to a system you've relied on for years. Now imagine that happening to dozens of major American companies within days, because according to reports surrounding one of the most unusual economic disputes in recent memory, that's exactly the kind of scenario that suddenly became possible after tensions between the United States and Switzerland escalated. And that's where this story begins. Because at first glance, it looks simple. Donald Trump announces new pressure. Switzerland finds itself in the spotlight. Political commentators begin predicting the usual outcome. Retaliation, negotiations, another international dispute added to a growing list of international disputes. Nothing unusual, nothing historic, nothing particularly surprising. But then something happened that completely changed how people viewed the situation. Because instead of asking whether Switzerland could withstand American pressure, people started asking a very different question. What if the United States was more dependent on Switzerland than most people realized? And that's where things get interesting. Because the moment that question entered the conversation, this stopped being a story about tariffs. It stopped being a story about politics. And it stopped being a story about who was stronger. Instead, it became a story about dependency. The kind of dependency nobody notices when everything is working normally. The kind that remains invisible for years, until suddenly, it doesn't. Think about electricity for a moment. Most people never think about it. You flip a switch, the lights turn on. That's it. The system works. Nobody asks questions. Nobody worries. Nobody even notices. And the moment it does, everyone suddenly remembers how much of daily life depends on something they rarely think about. That's what makes this story fascinating. Because according to the narrative that quickly began spreading through financial and political circles, people weren't discovering Swiss power. They were discovering Swiss importance, and those are not the same thing. Power is obvious. Importance often isn't. A powerful country can be seen. An important system usually can't, at least not until something disrupts it. Then everyone notices. And that's exactly why this story started attracting attention far beyond politics. Because if the reports were true, this wasn't simply about one disagreement between governments. This was about what happens when a system that people assume will always be available suddenly becomes uncertain. Businesses noticed, investors noticed, markets noticed, and perhaps most importantly, people who had never paid attention to Switzerland before suddenly started paying very close attention. Because the question was no longer, why is Switzerland responding this way? The question was, what exactly does Switzerland control that has everyone so concerned? And the answer to that question would reveal something most people never knew existed. Something that had quietly become part of the foundation of international business. Something that many companies had depended on for years without giving it much thought. And once that realization started spreading, the story became much bigger than anyone expected. Because what looked like a political dispute was slowly turning into a lesson about how the modern world actually works. A lesson about systems, a lesson about leverage, and a lesson about what happens when people suddenly discover that the things they depend on aren't always the things they control. And before long, that realization would trigger a chain reaction that nobody saw coming. At first, almost nobody thought much of it. That's important to understand, because when major political announcements happen, people expect headlines, they expect speeches, they expect reactions, they expect public confrontation. What they don't expect is silence. And that's exactly what made this situation so unusual. Because after the initial pressure campaign began attracting attention, many observers expected Switzerland to respond the same way countries usually respond, with statements, warnings, threats of their own, maybe even a direct escalation. Instead, the response appeared surprisingly restrained. And for a brief moment, it looked as though the entire story might fade away. The headlines moved on. Political attention shifted elsewhere. Commentators started discussing other issues, and to most people, it seemed like nothing significant had actually happened. But that's the thing about dependency. It doesn't usually announce itself. It reveals itself slowly. one problem at a time, one disruption at a time, one unexpected complication at a time. And according to the narrative that began emerging afterward, that's exactly what happened here. Because while politicians were still debating strategy, people operating inside the real economy started noticing something unusual. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just unusual. The kind of thing that initially looks like a technical problem, the kind of thing people assume will be fixed in an hour, then a day, then maybe a week, until they realize it isn't going away. Imagine you're responsible for paying an overseas supplier. You've done it hundreds of times before. The process is routine. You approve the payment, you send the transfer, and you move on with your day. Nothing exciting, nothing complicated. Then suddenly, the transfer doesn't go through. You check the information. Everything is correct. You contact support, you wait, you try once more. Still nothing. Now you're annoyed. But you're not worried. Not yet. Because surely it's just a temporary issue, right? That's how most people react when a system they've trusted for years suddenly behaves differently. They assume the problem is temporary. They assume somebody else will fix it. They assume normal service will resume. Because that's what usually happens. Except, sometimes it doesn't. And that's when uncertainty begins spreading. Not through governments, not through television studios, but through businesses. Because uncertainty is contagious. One failed transaction creates questions. Several failed transactions create concern. And once enough people start asking the same questions, concern turns into attention. That's when executives start making phone calls. That's when managers start requesting updates. That's when investors begin asking whether the issue is isolated or something larger. And that's when the mood changes, fast. Because businesses can handle bad news. What businesses hate is uncertainty. Bad news can be measured. Bad news can be planned around. Bad news can be priced into decisions. Uncertainty can't. And according to reports surrounding the dispute, uncertainty was becoming the most valuable piece of leverage in the entire situation. Because nobody seemed completely sure how far the effects might spread. Was this a temporary disruption, a warning, a negotiating tactic, or the first sign of something much bigger? Nobody had a clear answer. And that's exactly why people started paying attention. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about speeches. It wasn't about tariffs. It wasn't even about Switzerland. The conversation had shifted towards something far more important. How many parts of the global economy depended on systems most people never think about? And more importantly, what happens when those systems stop behaving the way everyone expects? That question would eventually lead to the biggest revelation in the entire story. A revelation that would completely change how people viewed the balance of power. Because the more people investigated what was happening, the more they realized the real issue wasn't who was applying pressure. The real issue was who could function without the system. And that's where the story takes a turn almost nobody saw coming. The deeper people looked into the situation, the stranger it became. Because up until this point, most observers were still viewing the story through a familiar lens, a political dispute, a negotiation, a contest of pressure, the kind of international disagreement that appears in headlines every year. But the more businesses started asking questions, the more one uncomfortable possibility began emerging. What if the real story wasn't about pressure at all? What if the real story was dependency? Because those two things are very different. Pressure is something you apply. Dependency is something you discover. And according to the narrative developing around the dispute, that's exactly what was happening. People weren't learning something new about Switzerland. They were learning something new about themselves. And that realization changed everything. Think about your phone for a moment. You own it. You paid for it. You use it every day. You probably know dozens of things it can do. But none of that matters if you lose access to the charger. Suddenly, the most powerful device in your pocket becomes limited by something much smaller. Not because the phone changed, because your dependency became visible. And that's what made this story so fascinating. The companies involved weren't weak. Many were struggling. Some operated across multiple countries. Some managed enormous amounts of money. Some were considered leaders in their industries. Yet even organizations of that size were forced to confront the same uncomfortable question. How much of what we do depends on systems we don't actually control? That's the moment the conversation changed. Because once people started asking that question, they stopped focusing on Switzerland and started focusing on infrastructure, the invisible infrastructure that quietly supports international commerce every day. The infrastructure nobody talks about when everything is working. The infrastructure that becomes front-page news only when something goes wrong. And the more attention those systems received, the more people realize how interconnected everything had become. A payment isn't just a payment. A transaction isn't just a transaction. Behind every transfer sits a network. Behind every network sits infrastructure. And behind that infrastructure sits trust. Years of trust. Sometimes decades. Trust so deeply embedded into daily business operations that people rarely stop to think about it. Until that trust becomes uncertain. Then suddenly everybody thinks about it. Businesses think about it. Governments think about it. Investors think about it. And once enough people start thinking about the same thing at the same time, the issue stops being technical. It becomes strategic. Because if access to a critical system can become uncertain, then dependency itself becomes a risk. And risks force decisions. That realization spread quickly, not because anyone wanted it to, but because uncertainty has a way of exposing connections people didn't know existed. Connections between countries, connections between companies, connections between industries. And once those connections become visible, the entire map starts looking different. That's exactly what was happening here. At the beginning of the story, most people assumed they already understood where the leverage was. The larger economy, the larger market, the larger negotiating position. Simple, obvious, predictable. Then reality complicated everything. Because as more information emerged, a different question started dominating conversations. Not who is bigger, but who depends on whom. And that question is far more dangerous, because it forces people to reconsider assumptions they've held for years. It forces governments to reassess vulnerabilities. It forces companies to reassess exposure. And it forces everyone else to acknowledge a simple truth. Modern power isn't always about ownership. Sometimes it's about access. Sometimes it's about infrastructure. And sometimes it's about controlling a piece of the system so important that nobody notices it until it's threatened. That's when the biggest realization of the entire story finally became impossible to ignore. The issue wasn't that Switzerland had suddenly become powerful. The issue was that people had finally realized how important certain systems were all along. And once that realization spread, the panic began moving far beyond a handful of companies. Because if one hidden dependency could create this much concern, how many others were still waiting to be discovered? By this point, the story had stopped being theoretical, and that's when things became much more serious. Because theories are easy to debate, possibilities are easy to dismiss, predictions are easy to ignore, but consequences demand attention. And according to reports surrounding the dispute, attention was arriving from everywhere. Not just politicians, not just financial analysts, but from the people who actually had to make decisions every day. The people responsible for keeping businesses running. The people responsible for keeping products moving. The people responsible for making sure customers received what they were promised. Because while political arguments often happen in public, their consequences usually appear somewhere else. Inside offices, inside factories, inside supply chains, inside boardrooms. And that's exactly where concern began growing. At first, only a few people were paying attention, then a few more, then entire departments, then entire companies. Because once uncertainty enters a system, nobody wants to be the last person to react. Imagine you're managing a manufacturing operation. Nothing dramatic, nothing glamorous. Your job is simply to keep production moving. Orders arrive, parts arrive, products leave. Everything functions, until one part of the process becomes uncertain. Now you're not just managing production, you're managing risk. You start asking questions. How long could this last? What happens if the disruption expands? What alternatives exist? Can routes be changed? Can exposure be reduced? And suddenly, a problem that looked distant starts feeling very personal. Because uncertainty always moves closer than people expect. That's why stories like this spread so quickly, not because everyone understands the technical details. Most people don't. But people understand risk, they understand dependency, and they understand what happens when systems stop behaving predictably. That's when executives begin scheduling emergency meetings. That's when investors begin requesting updates. That's when analysts begin revising expectations. Because markets may tolerate bad news, but they rarely tolerate uncertainty for very long. And according to the narrative developing around the dispute, uncertainty was becoming the dominant force in the entire situation. Nobody seemed completely certain how far the effects could travel. Nobody seemed completely certain who was exposed. Nobody seemed completely certain where the next problem might appear. That's what transformed concern into pressure. Because pressure wasn't coming from Switzerland anymore. Pressure wasn't coming from Washington anymore. Pressure was coming from reality. The reality that businesses needed stability. The reality that investors needed confidence. The reality that supply chains needed predictability. And reality has a habit of ignoring political narratives. Reality doesn't care who made the announcement. Reality doesn't care who won the press conference. Reality cares whether systems function. And if they don't, pressure begins building everywhere. That's exactly what appeared to be happening. The longer questions remained unanswered, the more attention the issue received. The more attention it received, the more people started examining how interconnected everything had become. And the more they examined those connections, the more one realization kept appearing. This wasn't really a story about one country. It wasn't even a story about one dispute. It was a story about what happens when people suddenly discover how much of modern business depends on systems they rarely think about. And once enough people reached that realization, the entire conversation changed. Because now nobody was asking, who started this? Instead, they were asking, how quickly can this be resolved? And that's the moment where every major confrontation becomes truly interesting. Because that's the moment where politics collides with economics. And economics usually has a way of forcing difficult conversations. Conversations about costs, conversations about risks, conversations about leverage, and most importantly, conversations about reality. Because by now, reality was revealing something that many people hadn't considered when the story first began. The side with the loudest voice wasn't necessarily the side holding the strongest position. And that realization would lead directly to the most important question in the entire story. A question that would completely change how people viewed power itself. Not who was stronger, but who actually had leverage. At the beginning of this story, the answer seemed obvious. The United States was the larger economy, the larger market, the larger global force. And when people look at a dispute like that, they naturally assume the larger side holds the leverage. Why wouldn't they? That's how power is usually measured. Size, money, influence, scale. Simple, easy, comforting. But as this story unfolded, that assumption became harder and harder to defend. Because the deeper people looked, the more they discovered something that appears throughout history again and again. The side with the most resources is not always the side with the most leverage. And those are two very different things. Imagine two people. One owns a massive mansion. The other owns the only well supplying water to that mansion. Now ask yourself, who has more resources? The answer is obvious. But who has more leverage? Suddenly, the answer isn't so obvious anymore. Because leverage isn't always about what you own. Sometimes, it's about what other people need. And that's the realization that began changing how many observers viewed this entire dispute. Because once the conversation shifted from power to dependency, everything looked different. The focus was no longer on who could apply pressure. The focus became who could absorb pressure, who could adapt, who could function if the relationship broke down. And that's where things became uncomfortable. Because those questions forced people to think beyond headlines, beyond speeches, beyond political narratives. They forced people to think about systems, the invisible systems supporting global commerce every single day. The systems that rarely make news because they're designed to operate quietly in the background, until suddenly they don't. And when that happens, people start discovering where the true pressure points exist. Not the obvious ones, the hidden ones, the ones nobody talks about when everything is working normally. That's why this story resonated with so many people. Not because Switzerland was involved, not because Trump was involved, but because the story exposed a pattern people recognize everywhere. Technology, energy, manufacturing, supply chains, transportation, finance. Again and again, modern economies depend on systems that seem invisible right up until the moment they're tested. And when they're tested, the balance of power can look very different than expected. That's exactly what appeared to be happening here, because every new development pushed the conversation toward the same uncomfortable question. What if leverage had been misunderstood from the beginning? What if the most important factor wasn't economic size? What if it wasn't political influence? What if it wasn't public pressure? What if it was dependency? Because dependency changes negotiations. Dependency changes strategy. Dependency changes outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, dependency changes confidence. The moment people realize they rely on something they cannot easily replace, their calculations start changing, their assumptions start changing, their priorities start changing, and that's where the biggest reversal of the entire story appears. At the beginning, the assumption was simple. Pressure would force Switzerland to react. By the middle, the assumption became less certain, and by this point, people were asking an entirely different question. Not, can Switzerland survive the pressure, but can the system function without the relationship? That question changes everything, because once negotiations become about necessity instead of preference, the entire game changes. The strongest side is no longer automatically the largest side. The strongest side may simply be the side controlling something the other side cannot easily replace. And if that realization sounds familiar, it's because the same lesson appears throughout history, again and again and again. Power attracts attention. Dependency determines outcomes. And that's why this story became so much bigger than a dispute between two countries. Because beneath the politics, beneath the headlines, beneath the public arguments, it was really a story about something much deeper. A story about discovering where leverage actually lives. And once enough people started asking that question, the conversation changed forever. Because now it wasn't about winning. It was about finding a way forward. And that's when reality finally entered the room. By now, the story had reached a point where nobody could ignore it anymore. Not governments, not businesses, not investors. Not the industries caught in the middle. Because once enough uncertainty enters a system, reality eventually demands answers. And reality is very different from politics. Politics can survive on narratives. Politics can survive on messaging. Politics can survive on public positioning. Reality cannot. Reality demands results. And that's exactly where this story was headed. Because the longer the uncertainty continued, the more expensive it became. Not necessarily in dollars, at least not at first, but in confidence, in planning, in predictability, the things businesses depend on every single day. Think about it this way. Imagine you're responsible for keeping a company running. You don't wake up every morning wondering who won yesterday's political argument. You wake up wondering whether operations will continue smoothly, whether contracts will be fulfilled, whether suppliers will deliver, whether customers will receive what they paid for. Those are the questions that matter. And eventually, those questions become more important than politics itself, because businesses can adapt to almost anything. New regulations, higher costs, different rules, unexpected obstacles. What they struggle to adapt to is uncertainty with no clear timeline. That's when pressure begins building from every direction. Pressure from shareholders, pressure from customers, pressure from employees, pressure from industry groups, pressure from everyone whose daily responsibilities depend on stability. And once that pressure becomes large enough, something interesting happens. The conversation changes. The goal is no longer, how do we win? The goal becomes, how do we stabilize this? That shift happens in almost every major confrontation. At first, people focus on victory. Later, they focus on solutions. Because eventually reality starts sending invoices. And reality's invoices are always expensive. The longer uncertainty lasts, the greater the cost. The greater the cost, the stronger the incentive to find an exit. That's why many of the most important negotiations in history didn't end because one side was destroyed. They ended because both sides eventually realized continuing was more expensive than resolving. And according to the narrative surrounding this dispute, that realization was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Because by now, everyone understood the same thing. The issue wasn't just Switzerland. The issue wasn't just America. The issue wasn't even the original disagreement. The issue was the system itself. The system businesses depended on. The system investors trusted. The system global commerce quietly relied upon every day. And once enough people understood that, the incentives started changing. Suddenly the conversation wasn't about demonstrating strength. It was about restoring confidence. Not because confidence sounds good, because confidence has economic value. When businesses are confident, they invest. When investors are confident, they allocate capital. When markets are confident, systems function smoothly. But uncertainty interrupts all of that, and uncertainty had become the central character in this story, which meant reality was now pushing everyone toward the same destination: resolution. Not because anyone wanted to admit defeat, not because anyone wanted to change their position, but because functioning systems are worth more than endless confrontation. And that's where the deepest lesson of the entire story begins to emerge. Because what happened here wasn't really about who looked stronger. It wasn't about who delivered the toughest statement, and it wasn't even about who made the first move. It was about what happens when assumptions collide with consequences. Because consequences have a way of revealing truths that arguments never can. And one truth had become impossible to ignore. Some systems are so important. People don't realize they're depending on them until they're forced to imagine life without them. That realization changed everything. And once people reached that point, the final question wasn't who won. The final question was, what did everyone learn? Because the answer to that question extends far beyond Switzerland, far beyond America, and far beyond this single dispute. It touches something much bigger, the way power actually works in a connected world. And that's where this story leaves us. In the end, the most interesting part of this story may not be what happened. It may be what it revealed. Because disputes between countries happen all the time. Trade disagreements happen all the time. Political pressure happens all the time. None of that is unusual. What made this situation different was the realization it forced people to confront. The realization that modern economies don't operate in isolation. They operate through networks, through relationships, through systems built over years and sometimes decades. Systems that quietly become part of everyday life. Systems that work so reliably that people stop thinking about them, until something interrupts them. And that's when their importance becomes impossible to ignore. Because for most of this story, people weren't really arguing about Switzerland. They weren't really arguing about tariffs. And they weren't really arguing about politics. Those were simply the events that brought a much larger question into focus. A question that extends far beyond this single dispute. Where does leverage actually come from? Is it size? Is it wealth? Is it influence? Or is it something less visible? Something embedded inside the systems that keep the world moving? Because one lesson appears repeatedly throughout history. Power attracts attention. Dependency determines outcomes. And the two are not always the same thing. Sometimes the strongest position belongs to the side everyone notices. Sometimes it belongs to the side nobody notices at all. Until suddenly, everyone does. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they tell us who won, not because they tell us who lost, but because they expose relationships that were previously invisible. Relationships between countries, relationships between businesses, relationships between systems. And once those relationships become visible, people start viewing the world differently, because every major disruption leaves behind a question. What other assumptions are we making today that only appear true because the system is still working? That's the question governments ask. It's the question businesses ask. And increasingly, it's the question investors ask. Because once a hidden dependency is revealed, it can never become invisible again. And if you're enjoying these deeper looks at the stories behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to USA News Now. Because some of the most important developments in global politics aren't the ones making the biggest headlines. They're the ones quietly changing how the world works. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The biggest vulnerabilities are rarely the ones people spend time discussing. They're often the ones people stop noticing entirely, until a single event forces everyone to pay attention. And when that happens, the conversation changes, the assumptions change, the calculations change, and sometimes the map of power changes too. Because in a connected world, the most important relationships are often the ones nobody thinks about until they're tested. And once they're tested, everyone discovers where the real leverage was all along. The question was never whether Switzerland could survive the pressure. The real question was, what would happen once everyone discovered where the pressure actually worked?